All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Nolan will turn the volume down a little bit for you guys so we're not blasting Leslie out of her chair and Kelly, the sensitive ones. Yeah, we don't want that. Cool. All right. I've been asked to announce that November, what? Yes, I'm announcing something. And I remembered to do it. See, that's a very bad thing to ask me to announce anything. I never remember. November 13th, Timothy and Maria are going to have their wedding celebration. And so that'll be at our house from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. And I'm assuming that means the church is all invited, right? Okay. So you're all invited to come from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. That is November 13th, which is a Saturday? It's a Saturday. Perfect. That's at our house. So you're all invited to come. All right. And then I think that's it. So we'll go ahead and get started. We are in John chapter 13, right? We're looking at 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, which is all one long conversation. Just to go over a little bit, summarize what we talked about a little bit last week, at least in the introduction. John is very unique, and if you've read the Gospels at all, you realize that right off the bat. It's Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar, and John is like completely different. But big reason, there's a number of reasons for that, but one of the big reasons why John is different is because John takes place in a very short period of time. Now, it covers the ministry of Jesus, but in very small portions of time, right? And so, an example of that is this passage that we're looking at, which is 13 through 17, which is like a quarter of the book, all takes place in less than 4 hours, right? So half of the book from chapter 11 on takes place in the last 2 months of the ministry of Christ. So half of the book of John takes place in a 2-month period of time, and these chapters 13 through 17, take place in less than 4 hours. It's one conversation. It's what happens after the Last Supper. So on the other Gospels, it records how Jesus had the Last Supper. He broke bread. Well, after that is this conversation. And then at the end of this conversation is when Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, and then you have what happens there. That's where the other Gospels pick up. And so what is essentially like just a blip in the other Gospels between the Last Supper and him going to the Mount of Olives is all these chapters in John where Jesus has what I'm calling his last conversation. And what we've looked at is you can roughly divide this up, at least for purposes of preaching or teaching. You could divide this up into 3 big categories, right? So you can say that this is his last conversation with his enemies, it's his last conversation with his friends, and it's his last conversation with his Father. It's a way of dividing that up. And we looked at the part of the first one last week, which is the conversation that Jesus had with his enemies. And that's because Judas Iscariot is present, Satan is present, and in that moment where John sets that stage, and we'll read the text in a minute, but John sets this stage so beautifully. Jesus then goes and does something totally unexpected, completely unexpected. Nobody expected it. And we have to conclude at to some point that he purposefully has done this as a message to his enemies, as a way of conversing with them, with Judas Iscariot and with Satan, because Christ tells us a little later on that he was cognizant of when Satan was present in his ministry and when Satan wasn't present, and that he scheduled what he said, the things he would tell others when Satan was there and not there. That all worked in to how Jesus conversed with his disciples and with those around him. So that's his conversation with his enemies. We're still going to be looking at that today, but let's read the text first again, which will be the first 30 verses of John. If you want, you can find them on the Freeborn website. It says at the top, there's a link that says service. You can click on that, and the text is there in paragraph format. I will warn you, I have edited out all the all the indicative moods, and so it's in simple mood, all right? Which indicative is whenever it says taketh, speaketh, whatever. That's the indicative mood. The simple mood is how we talk today, speak, take, right? So I've turned those into the simple mood because it's a lot easier for me to read. But if you like them, read them out of your Bible and you'll have them there. But I don't like stumbling over them. So that's why I've turned them into simple mood. Anyway, so here we go. We're going to start in verse 1. It says, "Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil having put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from God and went to God, he arose from supper, and laid aside his garments, and took a towel, and girded himself. After that he poured water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Then came he to Simon Peter, and Peter said unto him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered and said unto him, What I do, you know not now, but you will know hereafter. Peter said unto him, You will never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, If I wash you not, you have no part with me. Simon Peter said unto him, Lord, not my feet only, also my hands and my head. Jesus said unto him, He that is washed needs only to wash his feet, but is otherwise all clean. And you are all clean, but not all. For he knew who should betray him, therefore he said, You are not all clean. So after he had washed their feet and taken his garments, and was set down again, he said unto them, Do you know what I have done to you? You call me Master and Lord, and you say, Well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that is sent greater than he that sent him. And if you know these things, you're blessed if you do them. I speak not of you all. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled, he that eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. Now I tell you, before it come, that when it come to pass, you may believe that I am he. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that receives whomsoever I send receives me, and he that receives me receives him that sent me. When Jesus had thus said, he was troubled in spirit, and testified and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. Then the disciples looked one on another, doubting of whom he spake. Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. Simon Peter therefore beckoned to him, that he should ask who it should be of whom he spake. He then, lying on Jesus' breast, said unto him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, He it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. And after the sop, Satan entered into him. Then said Jesus unto him, What you do, do quickly. Now no man knew at the table for what intent he spake this unto him. For some of them thought, because Judas had the bag, that Jesus had said unto him, Buy those things that we have need of for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. He then, having received the sop, went immediately out, and it was night. Okay. So there's the first section of text. It's when you have Jesus knowing that his enemies are present, Satan's present, Judas Iscariot is present. He knows everything that's happened. That first paragraph is where he John sets the stage, he puts in the lighting, everything is there, and it's an amazing thing that's going on. Everything that's happening at that moment is incredible. They were not aware of it. We talked about that last week. It's called dramatic irony, right? If you look into theater, it's called dramatic irony. It's where you, the audience, know a lot more of what's happening than the characters or of the play know, right? The characters are ignorant of what's going on, but you, the audience, know what's going on. That's what John's setting up. He's telling you things that they did not know were happening at all. They just assumed they're having this sleepy supper with Jesus. Tomorrow's Passover. Tomorrow all the fireworks start. They're just taking a break. They're there. Who knows what they're talking about? They're having a good time. But what they don't realize is that underneath the surface of what appears to be nothing is an incredible amount of things unfolding all at once. Jesus knows about it. You know about it. They don't. And knowing all that's about it, then he says, this is what Jesus does, right? Having all this knowledge of what's about to happen, and you have that knowledge, what is he going to do? This is what he does. He takes off his clothes, puts on a towel, and washes people's feet. Completely unexpected. Not even you expected that. You only expected that because you read ahead, right? If you would have read that for the first time in your life and read everything that he just explained was going on, that Jesus has all power given to him at this moment, that he knows everything that's about to happen, that his enemies are present, that Satan is plotting against him, that all this is going on, you would not think, and the next thing he's going to do is wash everybody's feet. That's not what you would expect. It's not what I would expect. Nobody expected this. Completely out of left field. What is going on? Peter expresses the same sentiment. He had less knowledge than you did, but he still was appalled and aghast and puzzled. Like, what are you doing? What's going on here? And Jesus says this, and this is where we're going to pick up now on today. And Jesus says, you don't know what's going on right now. That's what he tells them. You don't know what's going on right now, but you will know in a little while. In a little while, you'll understand. Right? But you don't right now. And then when Jesus is done washing everyone's feet and he gets his clothes back on, he sits down with them and says, now do you know? Well, they didn't, right? Just like we didn't know when we first read it. But that's what he tells them. Do you know now? Well, they didn't, so then he explains it. And we're going to look at that in a second. And then when he's done explaining it, what does he tell them? Blessed if you know these things and do them. So this is the bookends of everything that Jesus just did. So if you want to take this foot washing that Jesus did, he washed all these people, all these disciples' feet, and you want to bookend it, that's the bookend in the text. You don't know what I'm doing. You will know what I'm doing. Do you know what I'm doing? Now that you know, you're blessed if you do it. So we can look at that and we can encapsulate what Jesus did as an object lesson. This was all about us knowing something. Now, we do need to look at a few, I do want to look at a couple textual issues with you to understand how these words are being used so that we can then talk about them. So let's first look at the word know. And both of these are interesting to me because it's what's so interesting to me about the English language. So we have words that have many meanings. Most languages do. English is especially this way. English words are very robust in meaning, which makes them very powerful. And it makes English literature very powerful because ambiguity is the friend of the author, right? When you have a very literal language, a very simple language that every word has very strict or very narrow meanings, it's much harder to write. It's a lot easier to write creatively, especially when you have languages that have this robust, wide range of meaning. English is that way. So for instance, know. Most languages in the world use several words to translate what we translate as know. For instance, in Spanish, you have conocer, right, and saber. And that comes from Latin. Latin uses the same two words, and most Latin-based languages have that division between know. Now, in English, we just say know. So you know math, and you can know your wife. Now, those are two very different things, but we use the same exact word. The Bible uses the same word to say how Adam had sexual relations with his wife, he knew his wife, to how somebody can know math. Same word. Nothing wrong with that. It's just how English is set up, right? Now, when we look at how what Jesus says, and we translate it in our Bible as know, is actually two words also. The first one is knowing in the sense of theory. It's how we know things. The way you know something, you have an experience. Like, for instance, you might know that China is a certain country in the world, but you've never been there, right? The second two that he uses is know in the sense of experience. Things you know because you've experienced them. It's empirical knowledge, right? So you might know a China in a theoretical way, but you can know Chinese food very experientially, right? Because you've been to a Chinese restaurant, so you've eaten it, and so you can say, I know that, whereas the other knowledge is more theoretical. It's the two different words that Jesus uses, and it's translated properly so because we have one word in English to do so. The last know, where he says, if you know these things, you're blessed, is again the theoretical knowledge. So that's how Jesus basically says, you don't know, you don't have the theory of this, but you will know them experientially, right? And do you now experientially know this? And now he says, now if you have the not theoretical knowledge, you should now act upon it. So that's how the text there is broken out. The first one, the theoretical one, we have the concept in English. We differentiate this very easily. So when someone says something to you you've never experienced and they explain it to you and you say, I see what you mean. Well, you're saying the same thing. In fact, the word that Jesus uses is exactly that. That is what that means. It's to see what somebody means. Obviously, you're not seeing it with your eyes. We say that it's metaphorical, right? I see what you mean. So when Jesus says, do you know, right? You don't know, when he says you don't know what I'm doing at the very beginning, what he's saying is you can't see what I mean. There's something, and this is particularly applied to spiritual truth in the scriptures. So when you have this and it uses it like this in the scriptures, is dealing with spiritual truth. And what Jesus is telling Peter is there's a spiritual truth that you can't see. But you're going to have an experience that is going to open up your metaphorical eyes, and you'll be able to see what I mean. You'll be able to understand it. This is what Jesus is telling him is going to happen. All right, one more word that we should consider, because it's important that we understand the words of the text if we're going to study them. And that's where he says, you call me master. Now, master is another one of these words that's very broad in English language. Very broad. And the English Bible translates a whole lot of words as master. A whole lot of them. That's why you got to be very careful when you do word studies, because, for instance, you have Adonai in the Old Testament, which will be translated at times as master and at times as Lord. And then you have several words in the Greek New Testament that are translated as master. And they don't all mean the same thing. And they don't mean the same thing in English either. So you may think, well, if it says master, it's always master. Okay, so there's different types of masters. For instance, you have the kind that we're not supposed to talk about anymore, right? Slave masters. That's a type of a master. But then some of you, I don't know if anyone here has a master's degree, but that's not a college degree on how to be a slave trader, right? That's a different type of master. And if you're an electrician, you might be a master electrician, and that's different too. And if you know anything about computers, and you have more than one hard drive in a computer, one of them is a master drive and the other is a slave drive, and that's a different type of a master. We use the word master in a lot of different ways, and so does the New Testament. And you have to be very careful if you really want to study in depth the scriptures, what these words are referring to. So when Jesus says, you call me master, what is he referring to? Well, he's referring to that's why modern translations translate it as teacher. Because he's referring to master in the sense of, think of master degree. Think of PhD, even though nowadays that's not the same thing, but in Jesus' time, that's essentially what it was. It would be, you call me doctor, you call me, Dr. Jesus, as in having expertise in what he's saying. You call me master, that's what it is. It's a degree. It's not the same idea as Lord, which is why he says, you call me master and you call me Lord. These are two very, very different things. In this particular text. You have to analyze every one. Now, how do we know? Well, for the most part, context makes it very clear. For the most part, context is really pretty easy. And you also can take an interlinear and just look it up, and you'll see that these come from different translations. Why did they translate it that way? Because when the King James Bible was translated, that's exactly what master meant. Nowadays, it's kind of fallen out of use. But it's important, if you're going to study the Scripture, that you know what it is. So in this moment, you shouldn't be thinking master as in Jesus is ruler or governor. That corresponds to Lord. What you should be thinking of when he says, you call me master, is you should be thinking of as master teacher. That's how you should be thinking at this moment. Why is this important? Well, one is because it says it there. And so for Jesus to make a point on it, to me means it's important that we understand it. But it's also because the lordship of Christ here is being contextualized as being part of or being contingent upon his teaching. Christ did not present himself as Lord simply because of let's call it divine right. But the lordship of Christ in with his disciples and in his ministry, and I believe in our lives also, is largely founded or built upon him as being our instructor. Jesus Christ, we see in his ministry with his disciples, very slowly became truly Lord in their lives. It was not from one moment to the next. It wasn't. You read how the disciples interacted with Jesus, and while they had at times a head knowledge that Jesus is the Lord, they didn't always have it in their hearts. And Jesus won them over, and he did it through his teaching. So it's important to understand that Christ, as much as he is Lord, as in ruler, king, sovereign, which he is every bit, he's also the great teacher. That's why Paul said that we must assent to the wholesome words of Jesus Christ. It's not just to his lordship, his rule, his reign that we have to submit to. It is to his teachings and his words, and he is the master teacher. It's not the apostles. It's very important to understand this. I know it's easy, especially if you're from churches that are that like ours, that put a lot of emphasis on the New Testament, especially the epistles. It's easy to think that the teachers of the church are the apostles. And I understand what's being tried to be said, but it's important to understand. The apostles had no ideas of their own. Well, Paul had one idea of his own. Paul's idea was you shouldn't get married. That was Paul's idea. He said, this is not Jesus's, this is mine. And nobody paid attention to him. Obviously. Right? So, Paul had one creative idea, and you all decided to call Jesus master instead. But it is, humor aside, it's very important that we understand that who we are learning from is from Jesus Christ. Very important. So that's what Jesus says. He says, you call me master, you call me teacher, you call me Lord, and you do well, because I am your Lord, and I am your teacher. I am your master. All right. All right, so let's think about for a minute what Jesus is saying here when he's talking about this. What is Jesus doing with this? So he says, he gets all ready, he's going to do this thing, and he gets to Peter, and it seems to me that Peter was actually first. The story's non-linear, and so in the story it can seem like Peter's like not first. It seems to me, just because of how it develops, he's probably first. But anyways, he gets to Peter. He's going to wash Peter's feet, and Peter says, there's no way in the world you're washing my feet. And we're going to talk about that next week, more about that, because that's very important also. But he says, there's no way in the world this is going to happen. And Jesus tells him, if I don't wash you, you have no part with me. And of course, Peter, I love Peter, he immediately flips, like, well, then don't stop there. Head to toe, right? Head to toe, let's do it all. And Jesus explains it. But what Jesus tells him, and this is what I want us to consider today. What Jesus tells him is, you don't know what's happening. Well, that tells us is that something's happening here beyond what we think is happening. Now, there are churches that take this very literally, and that's wonderful. I just don't go to those churches, but they take it very literally, and they'll actually have foot washing services. And I want to tell them, you don't know what was going on. Because we don't have a single instance of this ever happening again, literally or physically. There's no instance in the Acts where they said, and then they had their foot washing service. If what Jesus was doing was giving us an example that we ought to actually get out a basin of water and wash each other's physical feet, well, then Peter knew exactly what was going on. There was no misunderstanding at all, right? But he tells him, you don't know. You cannot see what I mean right now. You cannot conceptualize. You do not have any understanding of what's going on. Just let me do this, and then you're going to understand something. Something you didn't understand before. So something is happening here that Jesus is doing that is not what is on the surface. It's something that lies under the surface. Now, what Jesus was doing, and there's a lot of things. I don't want to come across like this is like the one thing. There's so much that happens here. In fact, Jesus Christ himself makes many points on this and does with this, which we're not going to get into. But one of the things that is happening here that I think is important to understand is that Jesus Christ was drafting them into service. I say drafting because he didn't give them an option. This wasn't volunteer, right? He goes and he washes their feet, and when he's done, he says, do you know what I've just done to you? And they didn't. And so then he explains it. And when he explains it, what he tells them is, I have enlisted you, I have drafted you, I have constrained you into a lifelong commitment. What you just experienced was constrained you to a lifelong commitment. You cannot back out. You are compelled. Now that seems awfully unfair if you think about it. I mean, think if I came in here and did some formula or some ritual, and then I said, and now, right, you have to do this for the rest of your life. You'd be like, well, shouldn't I have known that before we started this? I thought I was just getting my feet washed. And Jesus says, no, that wasn't what was happening. You didn't know. Now you know, and what you know is, for the rest of your life, you're committed to a way of life. Well, that's what he did. He constrained him. The apostles understood this. They talk about this. For instance, Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, speaking of how the apostles give themselves for the church, he said, for whether we be beside ourselves, it is to God. Or whether we look crazy, it's for God. Or if we're sober, if we seem sane and sophisticated, it's for you, for your cause. For the love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge that if one died for all, then we're all dead. And that he died for all, that they which live should not henceforth live unto themselves, but unto him which died for them and rose again. He says, the apostles, he says, we have decided, we live under this persuasion that no matter what happens in our life, it is all for God and all for you. He says it in a different way in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. What does he tell them in 1 Corinthians chapter 3? He says, I had it. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, he says, all things are yours. Speaking to the church. Everything. Everything in heaven, everything on earth, but the apostles, everything is yours. He's saying that the apostles, you're not ours, we're yours. Everything we do is for you. In another place it says, in 1 Peter, Peter puts it this way. Peter says that all the prophets spoke of this time. And it was told to them that they weren't speaking for themselves, but for you. Imagine that. What wasn't for them, they weren't ministering for their sake. It's not like you're in the long tail of the church and you're just coming along and the apostles and the prophets did their thing for them and the apostles did their thing and then you come along and you're just sort of following on the tail. Peter says, no, not at all. He says, everything of the prophets, the apostles, all of that time was all given by God, was all engineered by God for your sake. You're the point. Upon you, all history comes together. You, sitting here today, which, as we saw in Peter, is very important. This is the mindset, the worldview that Peter wants you to have. Stop thinking of yourself as being inconsequential or insignificant. You are incredibly significant and incredibly consequential. All of history has come down on you. And everything that God did through the prophets, He did not for them, but for you. Right? For you. So this is how the apostles thought. This was their mindset. Why was this their mindset? Because Jesus commissioned them at this moment in John 13. At this moment, He had commissioned them. He drafted them into this service. He got down on His knees. He washed their feet. And when He got done, He says, you call me, and this is where He got the right to do so. This is where He got the right to do so. He says, you call me teacher, and you call me Lord. And I am your teacher, and I am your Lord. And so this is what I've done. I've washed your feet so that you will wash other people's feet. That's what He tells them. That's what I've done. It may seem like what I've done is just this inconsequential act. And it was. It was the thing performed by the least valuable person of the household. When, in those days, when people would come over to your house, you'd have a basin of water, and whoever was the least important person would wash everyone's feet. That was his job, or her job, whoever that was. That was their job. Right? It didn't seem like it was important. It seemed like what Christ was doing was denigrating and demeaning. And Christ says, no. What I'm doing right now is drafting, commissioning, compelling, constraining all of you into a service, a lifelong service. Do you know what I've done to you? Do you understand what I've done to you? Now, He uses the empirical knowledge. Do you empirically? Have you experienced it? Do you have now through the experience? Do you see what I'm saying? Do you understand? You thought, oh, this is embarrassing. Oh, this is inconsequential. Oh, this is weird. This is out of place. And Jesus says, no, you don't understand. But now let me explain it to you. This is what has happened. So what does that mean for us? All right. Well, like I said, this does not mean that we're going to bring out the basins of water and we're all going to watch. You come close to me with that, I'm going to hit you with a stick. Stay away from me. That's not what He's trying to get us to do. Not at all. I joke. Look, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to let anyone wash my feet like that. I think they don't understand the Scriptures. I think it's a lot of theater, and it doesn't have any real meaning. The meaning is here in the text, and we already know what the real meaning is. But here's the deal. If you understand what Jesus says you don't know, and you then know it, if you understand it, you're going to wish you could just wash somebody's feet. You're going to wish it was that. And if you don't wish that it was actually washing people's dirty feet with water and a towel, then you do not know what Jesus did to you. You don't know what He did to you. It's like people who think that if they become Christians, well, they're going to have to quit drinking, or they're going to have to quit cussing, or I don't know. They have a list. They always say, well, if I become a Christian, do I have to quit this? It's like, if you think that's the bad thing about being a Christian, the hard thing, I should say, then you haven't understood Christianity. Christ has something far worse. You're going to wish it was that. In fact, when you see what Christ wants from you, you're going to say, please, take my drinking, take my cussing, take all of it, take it all. Just don't ask that from me, right? Because when you find out what Christ really wants from you, that all is like, I'd rather give Him that. That's better. Same way here. Jesus, when he did this, he had something in mind. And what he wants from us is so much greater, so much more difficult than this. This would be easy. We could just do this once a Sunday and be done with it. You'd be happy to do it when you hear, if you ever figure out what he really wants from you. So what did Jesus really meant? Well, the apostles, they kind of flesh it out in their epistles, in their writing. They flesh it out. For instance, Paul explains that what this means is that we need to bear one another's burdens. He says this in Galatians chapter 6. He says, "Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Listen to this, bear ye one another's burdens," and here's the key, "and so fulfill the law of Christ." Bear one another's burdens, because that is fulfilling, that is living the law of Christ. Now, what's the law of Christ? Anybody have an idea? Anybody know? What's the law of Christ? You should all know. But love each other, right? Love each other as I have loved you. Where do you think that law comes? Where do you think you find that written? Anybody know? You should know. No, not love your neighbor. The law of Christ. But where? What chapter? John 13. Right after the foot washing. That's the law of Christ. Paul says, how do you fulfill the law of Christ? What does that mean? When he did that and he enlisted them, he drafted them into a service, into a requirement, under a law, how did they go about fulfilling that? Jesus said, I've washed your feet, and now you're going to wash everyone else's feet. What did he mean by that? He meant you're going to bear one another's burdens. Paul says that's how we fulfill the law of Christ. We bear each other's burdens. When somebody has trouble, we don't just let them be by themselves. We take the time. We take the effort. And it's not just the ones we like. This is very important. We all are willing to help out people we like. But and I'm not even talking about the lost. I'm talking about in the church. In the church, there's people you like, and there's people you less like. Let's put it that way. Right? Particularly those you less like. You should be looking, not asking people, how are you doing, but really not wanting to hear the answer. That's a formality. It's like, that's politeness. How are you doing? I'm doing fine. You're not supposed to say, well, I have a real burden and I need some help. It's like, la, 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 la. Don't want to hear that. No, we should be actively looking in our congregation, amongst our brethren, amongst the children of God, how we can help carry someone else's burden. That's what Jesus was commanding you to do when he washed your feet. You say, well, when did he wash my feet? Because he washed the apostles. The apostles washed those who followed them. They washed, and somebody bore your burden, and you need to bear someone else's. But that's just getting us started. James talks a little bit about this. He has a different iteration of it, and that is that we should confess our faults one to another. This is a very important component of church. It's one that is often overlooked. We become very doctrinal, and we go to church, and it's about sermons. We got the sermon hour, it's teaching, and these things. But in reality, church ought to be much more about fellowship. And by that, I don't mean donuts. I know you all are starting to run. You heard every time they hear fellowship, they run to the back table. It's like Pavlov's dogs, right? They hear that, and they're looking for donuts. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about actual biblical fellowship. Unity. Instead of in fellowship thinking of like Shipley's, think fellowship Lord of the Rings. Not the Fat Hobbit. No, don't think of unity. That's the fellowship that we're dealing with here. This is what the church is really about. I'm not diminishing the need for teaching and exhortation, and we give that a lion's share of time. That's all fine, But you need to understand that what we really need in church is praying for each other, confessing our faults one to another, helping one another. This is what the church ought to be above all things. A fellowship of believers, not a hierarchy where someone speaks to others, but we all together. We say, what is the open meeting? Well, sure, it's an opportunity to preach or teach, sure. But it's so much more than that, and we've diminished it in some way by making it only that. We have to be very careful. The open meeting is where we come together and minister to each other. And that may be through psalms, through hymns, through prayer, through confession. All of these things are very important. James says, confess your faults one to another and pray for one another that ye may be healed. The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. It is forgiving one another's trespasses. It is forgiving one another's trespasses. That is what washing your feet is. That's what Jesus was saying. He says, you're clean, but you need to have your feet washed. And what he's saying metaphorically is, look, I've forgiven you. In the sense of salvation, you're saved, but you regularly need to be cleaned up a little bit. You get dirty a little on your feet. That needs to be cleaned, even though the rest of you is clean. That's why he refused to wash his hands and his head, because it would break the metaphor, it would break the type. The type was, Peter was completely clean, it's just his feet that were dirty, and he needed that routine cleaning, and that's what Jesus was doing. And how do we do that? Well, we do that for each other. When he talks about forgiving our I can forgive all your trespasses you commit against me, and that's not going to save you. That's a cleansing that Judas Iscariot got. He got his feet washed, and he wasn't any bit clean afterwards. So we're not talking about any type of forgiveness that is eternally useful to you. This is a daily forgiveness that we can grant each other. And we must do so. It is a horrible sin that we Christians are so unforgiving. It is not something that you should take lightly in yourself, or I should take lightly in myself. I know it. I understand it. I am not pointing fingers at anybody. I get it. There are people, even born-again Christians, who I like less. Now be careful, we're being recorded, right? who have done something that I consider intolerable, and you hold that grudge. You may not be nasty or ugly, but you hold that against them. You're not willing to let it go. You're not willing to overlook it. You're not willing to forgive it. You hold it in your heart, and it's wrong. It's just wrong of us. It is what Christ has drafted us to be. He drafted us at this moment when he washed our feet, that we should wash other people's feet. You say, but it's demeaning. They treated me very ugly, very nasty, and it's very demeaning for me to treat them, to forgive them in that way, to overlook it, to let it go, to let charity cover the multitude of sins. It's very demeaning. Exactly. That's the metaphor. Christ on his knees, like a slave, washing the feet of people who are not worthy to be in the same room as him. And now he says, do you know what I've done to you? Do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher. You call me Lord. I am your teacher. I am your Lord. And as your teacher and your Lord, I have washed your feet so that you can know something. You need to do that also. One more thing of this. It is to please one another and not oneself. This kind of is a summary of this, really, right? To please others and not yourself. Look for what makes other people happy. And I'm especially speaking of other Christians. What makes your brothers and sisters in Christ happy, even if it makes you unhappy? We could solve a whole lot of disputes in the church if we would all just learn to wash each other's feet in this way. What do you need? Not sarcastically. I know I say it, but I mean it sarcastically. No, what do you need? See, I say it sarcastically. No, not that way. It's, what do you need? What can I do for you, even if it puts me out? How can I accommodate your feelings, your views, your needs, your weaknesses, your strengths, even if it inconveniences me? How can I do that? That's what Jesus did. He inconvenienced himself. He put aside his honor for yours. He put aside his worthiness, his good name, all those things that he lost when he did this humiliating act. He put all that aside for you so that you could be elevated, so you could be high, so you could be clean. In Romans 15, Paul puts it this way. He says, "Now the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, that ye may abound in hope through the Holy Ghost. For even Christ pleased not himself." So what Jesus has done here, and this isn't like trying to take something and make a lot of it. Jesus has made it clear. I'm doing something that on the surface isn't what I'm doing. I'm doing something and you think I'm doing this over here, washing feet. I'm not. I'm conscripting an army of people who are going to behave a certain way, and it's going to be their lifestyle, their worldview. Right? Now, to wrap this up very quickly, we're out of time. Got 5 minutes. Okay, blue. It's blue, Marco.
Yes, it is. I
got
think
a
it
telling.
is. I don't. Can you hear me?
I do.
We got a question. It's asking, why do you think Jesus washed Judas's feet?
Because the whole metaphor, and again, there's many things that are happening here. We're only dealing with one sliver of all that Jesus was teaching. He was teaching, by his own admission, he was teaching a great deal number of things. And one of the things he was teaching is that washing of the feet was all the true believer needed, but was nothing what the unbeliever needed, right? So if we were to take this as a metaphor for the let's say the rituals of the church assembly, where we come together, we have the Lord's Supper, we do baptism, we do public confession, we do these things that are rituals. Well, if you're a true believer, they do immense good for you. Because you're all clean, and yet because you're all clean, you notice there's parts, very small parts of you, that are unclean, right? You have surface contamination. And as a true believer, you come in and those things set you right. But if you're not a true believer, they do absolutely zero for you. Zero. You can take the Lord's Supper, it won't hurt you, and it won't help you. You can be baptized 100 times. They can hold you under until you barely can hold your breath anymore. And it will not help you. That's what Jesus taught. And we'll deal with that more, but I hope that answers the question. I assume that was an online question? Oh, from the 2 or 3 in our video audience. Got it. Okay, so to wrap this up, Christ constrained them, right? He conscripted them. And why did he do that in the presence of his enemies? Why not later on in the supper? Why when Judas Iscariot was there? Why when Satan is present watching? Because, remember, this is a conversation also with his enemies. And he is preparing. We know because his prayer later, he makes it clear, and he says it earlier in the setup to the thing. One of the concerns in Jesus' mind was he was leaving, and all his disciples, including us, were going to stay behind, and he wasn't going to be there to defend them. He wasn't going to be there to fight Satan off of them as he had been doing up until this point. So he has to prepare them. He has to get them ready to do battle. And often we think, well, that means he's going to teach them to memorize Scripture, and he's going to teach them doctrines, and he's going to... Nope. He says, here's how I'm going to get you ready to battle Satan. I'm going to wash your feet. And then you're going to wash other people's feet. And you think, well, that doesn't make any sense. Good doctrine is not going to protect you from Satan. Christians are not in sin because their doctrine is poor. At all. You're not in sin and then you go, oh, it's because I didn't understand Romans chapter 7. If I would have only understood Galatians chapter 3, it never would have happened. That is not, come on, be honest. Be honest. One of the great paradoxes of the Bible is Solomon, the wisest man on earth. He has all this knowledge. He writes Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and look how he lives. You think it's because he didn't know what the unvirtuous woman was going to become? You thought, what? Of course he knew. He didn't care. He didn't care. Sin isn't a mind problem. It's a heart problem. So Jesus wants to get them ready for all these things and get them ready to battle Satan. He wants Satan to know they're ready. And so this is what he does. He washes their feet. Why? Well, 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 10. Look what Paul says. Incredible. To whom ye forgive anything. He's talking about, the context is the man who had committed that horrible sin, right? In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, terrible, terrible sin. And now he's talking about that guy who's repented. He says, to whom you forgive anything, I forgive also. For if I forgave anything to whom I forgave it, for your sakes forgave I it in the person of Christ. Now here's the point, here's the good point. Lest Satan should get an advantage over us, for we are not ignorant of his devices. How do we guard ourselves against Satan in the church? Washing each other's feet. That's how we do that. Forgiving each other, bearing each other's burdens, lifting each other's feeble hands up, like it says in Hebrews. That's how we do that. We don't defend against Satan by one David marching out with a sword against a Goliath. You're going to lose. You have no strength that you think you have. And it isn't by knowing lots of verses by memory. And that is not to say there's anything wrong with knowing verses by memory. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But it won't protect you from Satan. These little things, these humble things, these things that follow the example of our teacher, our master, and our Lord, that's what we need to be doing. Bearing each other's burdens, pleasing each other and not ourselves, forgiving one another, confessing our faults one to another. That's what we need to be doing. And if we would be doing more of that, we would be having less of the trouble. And we're out of time. Okay, thank you.